If you were to travel roughly 40 miles off the western coast of Australia to the Houtman Abrolhos archipelago, you would find a chain of tiny, sun-scorched coral islands that look like untouched tropical paradises. But beneath the blinding white sands of Beacon Island lies a horrific secret that archaeologists have been painstakingly unearthing for decades: a sprawling network of shallow mass graves containing the violently butchered remains of men, women, and children. The skeletal remains tell a story of unimaginable terror, bearing the unmistakable jagged marks of heavy sword strikes, crushed skulls, and defensive wounds sustained by people who were slaughtered, not by savage locals or enemy soldiers, but by their own friends, crewmates, and protectors. This island is known to history as Batavia's graveyard, and the blood soaked into its sand was spilled in 1629 during a catastrophic shipwreck that gave rise to a psychopathic, murderous cult. It is a meticulously documented true story of treachery, systematic slaughter, and a desperate fight for survival that makes Lord of the Flies look like a children's fairy tale. In October of 1628, the Batavia, the gleaming new flagship of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, set sail from the Netherlands on her maiden voyage toward the spice-rich port of Jakarta. She was a floating fortress, heavily armed and packed to the brim with over 300 passengers, vast sums of silver, and an immense cargo of luxury goods, making her one of the wealthiest vessels to ever navigate the treacherous global oceans. But the ship was a powder keg of human tension, commanded by the strict and increasingly ill senior merchant Francisco Pelzart, who was deeply despised by the ship's seasoned and arrogant skipper, Arian Jacobs. As the grueling months dragged on and the ship crossed the unforgiving expanse of the Indian Ocean, Jacobs found a sinister confidant in the ship's undermerchant, an incredibly charismatic and bankrupt former apothecary named Geronimus Cornelis. Cornelis was a smooth-talking heretic who secretly subscribed to a twisted radical philosophy which dictated that all human desires, no matter how depraved, were the will of God, and therefore it was impossible for him to commit a sin. Together, Cornelis and Jacobs silently gathered a faction of disgruntled sailors and hardened soldiers, plotting a violent mutiny to murder Pelzart, seize the staggering fortune of silver in the hold, and turn the magnificent Batavia into a heavily armed pirate warship. But before the mutineers could spring their bloody trap, the ocean intervened with catastrophic force on the pitch-black morning of June 4, 1629, when the Batavia slammed violently into the razor-sharp Morning Reef off the uncharted Australian coast. The mighty ship was instantly gutted, leaving the terrified survivors to desperately swim and paddle through the freezing, churning surf to a tiny, barren strip of coral that offered absolutely no fresh water and zero shelter from the punishing elements. Believing that a slow, agonizing death by dehydration was imminent, Commander Pelzart, Skipper Jacobs, and a select few officers made a highly controversial and devastating decision. They boarded the ship's only surviving longboat and abandoned the 300 stranded men, women, and children to row thousands of miles toward Jakarta in a desperate bid to find a rescue vessel. With the lawful commander gone, the stranded survivors looked for leadership, and a power vacuum was immediately filled by the charismatic psychopath Geronimus Cornelis, who had survived the wreck and washed ashore days later. Realizing that rescue might actually come, Cornelis knew that if Pelzart returned, the planned mutiny would be exposed and he would swing from a hangman's noose. Therefore, to ensure his own survival, Cornelis decided that the population of the island had to be drastically, systematically eliminated. Cornelis seized control of the salvaged weapons and provisions, forming a fiercely loyal inner circle of mutineers who dressed in fine silks looted from the wreckage, establishing a totalitarian nightmare where he wielded absolute life and death over the terrified civilians. Knowing he could not fight the loyal VOC soldiers stationed on the island, Cornelis devised a cunning trap, sending a detachment of heavily armed soldiers under the command of a courageous officer named Wiebe Hayes to a distant, seemingly waterless island to search for a well, promising to rescue them later, but fully expecting them to die of thirst. With the soldiers exiled, Cornelis initiated his reign of terror, ordering his brainwashed followers to begin culling the survivors to preserve food and water, turning the island into an industrial slaughterhouse. The bloodlust rapidly escalated into open sadistic executions where mutineers publicly slashed the throats of infants, murdered entire families in their tents, and claimed the surviving women as their personal property. In total, Cornelis and his men brutally murdered over 110 innocent people in a matter of weeks, believing they were completely untouchable. But Cornelis made a fatal miscalculation. Against all odds, the exiled soldier Wiebe Hayes and his 40 loyalists had miraculously discovered a fresh water spring on their barren island, and when a few desperate escapees floated over on makeshift rafts bearing the horrific news of the massacres, Hayes immediately prepared his men for a brutal, unavoidable war. Utilizing brilliant military tactics, Wiebe Hayes and his 40 loyalists constructed a formidable chest-high fortress out of sharp coral rock, the first European structure ever built on Australian soil, and armed themselves with heavy wooden pikes topped with rusted iron spikes. When Cornelis realized the soldiers had survived, he launched multiple desperate amphibious assaults against the fort, but Hayes and his men fought with ferocious, unyielding courage, repelling the heavily armed mutineers and eventually capturing the charismatic psychopath Cornelis himself during a botched parley. The remaining mutineers launched one final overwhelming assault on Hayes's fort to rescue their leader, and they nearly broke through the defenses until a sail appeared on the horizon. Commander Pelzart had miraculously returned aboard the rescue ship Sardam. A desperate, frantic race ensued as both Wiebe Hayes and the remaining mutineers rowed furiously toward the rescue ship, but Hayes arrived just moments earlier, shouting a frantic warning that the approaching men were murderers intent on seizing the vessel. Pelzart immediately aimed the ship's heavy cannons at the mutineers, forcing their unconditional surrender, and the horrific truth of Batavia's graveyard was finally brought to the light. The justice dealt to the murderers was swift, absolute, and merciless. Geronimus Cornelis and his most vicious followers had both of their hands chopped off with a hammer and chisel before being dragged to the gallows and hung by the neck till dead on the desolate coral reefs. The wreck of the Batavia remains a chilling testament to the fragility of human morality, a dark historical stain, proving that the most terrifying monsters in the world aren't found in fiction, but hiding quietly among us, just waiting for the rules to disappear. Thank you for joining me in the dark. If you survived this historical descent, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what historical horror should we uncover next?